Welcome to the Strategic Leader Podcast with me, Gemma Bullivant, and my co-host, Fiona Craig. This podcast is for HR professionals and people-focused leaders from any function who want to think, act, and feel naturally more strategic. Enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to episode 7 about blockers to strategic thinking. Good morning, Gem. How are you doing?
Hi, Fee. I am doing very well, thank you. Almost recovered from some frenzied social activity.
Your life is one big frenzied social activity, though, right? You have the best social life of anyone I know.
I do have moments of quiet, but I would definitely not call the last few weeks as anything like quiet. So I've had a friend staying, a really good friend who was visiting over from New Zealand. So we had a lot to catch up on, as you can imagine. And she was very, very focused on making the most of London. Which I can tell you was quite exhausting.
It sounds exhausting and expensive, but great, though, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a great city and the weather was kind to us and we had lots of fun.
Sounds fabulous. I'm just going to say one word to describe my weekend, which was scaffolding. We were painting the back of the house, so nowhere near as interesting as yours. And hence, let's move swiftly on to our subject matter.
Yes.
We're talking about perfectionism today.
Yeah.
Jem, would you describe yourself as a perfectionist?
Well, no, even though I do actually very much focus on quality of work, I think that driver is overtaken by my action driver and getting stuff done. So I don't tend to get too caught up in perfectionism, but I'm sure we'll explore all that in our conversation. What about you?
I would say also a no. I think that I have too many ideas. My ideas come too thick and fast, and so I kind of have to jump on them and do as much as I can in the moment with them before they leave my brain. So I kind of live with the fact that nothing's going to be perfect. What I have tried to do is set up my career such that I work with other people who are able to finish things off for me. So if you think about the bell bin team roles, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Gem, I figure really strongly on the plant, which is kind of kicking off things. And I score very lowly on completer finisher. So I try and work with people who can make things that I do really good quality or indeed possibly even close to perfect. But trying to achieve that myself is just a hiding to nothing. So I'm not. However, having said that, I know that I'm sure you do, talk to a lot of coachees who are bringing perfectionism with them to work every day. So let's just have a look at some of the characteristics that show up. What are some of the characteristics that we can see when somebody is heading towards perfectionism? I mean, people sort of bandy this term around and they sort of fling it around, oh, I'm a perfectionist, as if it's something to be proud of, or perhaps sometimes as if it's something to regret. So I think we have mixed feelings about the word, but what are some of the characteristics that we see in perfectionists?
Well, it's a bit of a trope answer to the interview question, isn't it? What's your biggest weakness? Oh, I'm a perfectionist. That's one of those.
That's so true. I think possibly even I have rolled that one out on an occasion.
But if we look at what we mean by that, it's about setting really high standards. And I mentioned earlier, if I do set myself quite high standards.
But are
as
they,
I
when you
said-
say high, are they too high? Is it problematic that they're high? Because you might hear, oh, well, high standards and go, well, obviously we all want that. But are we saying, is it just high standards or is it unreasonably high standards?
Well, I suppose my definition of success is not just about the quality. So I have a few factors that I look at when I'm thinking about whether I've done something in the way that I want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the quality aspect is definitely one part of it, but it's not the only part of it. Progress is really important for me. Action is really important. I mentioned this action driver, getting things done.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit of a conundrum. You know, you mentioned the Belbin team roles. I score highly in both plant and completer finisher. What do you
Ooh,
make of that?
well, I mean, I'm not an expert in Belbin. That seems fairly unusual. But then, we're all different, aren't we? We all have different combinations. If you're listening and thinking, well, what are Belbin team roles? It's a kind of diagnostic tool for understanding your kind of natural role in teams. Really interesting one. Maybe we'll do a podcast on it at some point. But just, Google it, Belbin team roles, and it's really easy to get your head around.
Mm.
But that does strike me as being fairly unusual, maybe?
Well, I never seem to fit any of the comfortable profiles for any of these things, but that's probably a whole other
Oh,
episode
it's
in and
probably
of
a good thing
itself.
though. Who wants to be put in a box, right?
Mhm. But yes, it's about holding ourselves to a really unreasonably high standard, isn't it? It's almost having that kind of that expectation of the work that we produce or the contribution that we make of an exceptionally high standard. When I meet people who identify with perfectionism as a trait for themselves, it typically comes back to this idea that nothing is quite good enough, or that if you think about it, you can't really define clearly how much is enough. When you say, is it good enough? Well, what would be good enough? Tell me at what point this feels like it is good enough to go forward, or to have your name attributed to it, or for you to feel confident to stand by it. That definition of enough can sometimes be quite tricky for people to define.
So that's an interesting one, isn't it? Which is, if we kind of think it's not good enough, who defines enough and
Mm,
how? Like, so you gave that example of saying, well, it needs to be good quality, but it also needs to be finished. It also needs to be done in a fairly efficient way, along with all the other things that need to get done. So, you can kind of define that good enough there, can't you?
mm,
I wonder, because I know that being highly critical of oneself is another characteristic. And I'm wondering whether, if you do describe yourself as having perfectionist tendencies, whether you're ever not critical of yourself. Do you think it's possible to go, no, actually, that is really good. I'm really proud of that. I'm really pleased with that. It's ready to go. Or whether there's always an element of kind of self-criticism there. Like it will
mm,
never be good enough, and kind of that's the point. You can only ever achieve 90% or 95%.
mm,
Because that high level of criticism towards yourself is deeply characteristic, isn't it? And also,
mm,
to a certain degree, kind of critical of others, because, or there is a risk, isn't there,
mm.
that that criticism could spill out to other people, because it's quite hard to have one set of standards for yourself and then to cut everyone else a lot more slack. I mean, maybe that does happen.
Absolutely. And if it's not good enough for yourself, then your standards you might be reflecting onto other people as well. And it can cause a bit of tension in micromanagement, maybe, where
Yes.
you feel really compelled to dive into the detail of a task when really, as a strategic leader, you need to be staying in tune with the bigger picture, but you find yourself really drawn to the detail from the angle of perfectionism and needing that detail to be 100%.
That's really important from a strategic point of view, and I think we'll probably come back to that when we talk about
Mm,
how to unpick it. But yeah, let's definitely come back to that from a strategic perspective. Other characteristics that we see when we're looking at perfectionism, it can be quite a fear-based characteristic, can't it? A fear of falling short, a fear of failure, a fear of being kind of found out. There's some parallels here to some of the other blockers that we've talked about across the series. I guess some kind of overlap with imposter syndrome, perhaps, in the big Venn diagram of things that can hold us back. But it does feel quite fear-driven, doesn't it?
I think this idea of a Venn diagram is really useful. I always engage with visuals anyway, but the idea that some of these things, when we think about some of our other episodes on these different blockers,
Yeah.
they do overlap, don't they? They don't operate in isolation of each other.
You're right. I mean, I guess there's probably some anxious thinking that's going on. And procrastination even. I mean, I guess we don't often associate procrastination with perfectionism, but I mean, I get this. I've described myself not as a perfectionist, but this is something I can identify with, which is I want to do a task and I want to do it well. And I'm kind of working through well, I
Mm.
can't do that until I've done that bit, and I can't do that bit until that bit's sorted out, and I can't do that bit until that bit's sorted out. So kind of working backwards, I end up kind of not even starting it because trying to sort of get all my ducks in a row before I even start, and most of those ducks don't want to play ball, so I don't start. So,
Mm.
there's that kind of procrastination that comes up from wanting to do it really well, which seems like it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? It feels like, oh, if I want to do a perfect job, I'm just going to crack on with it.
Mm.
So
Mm.
there's that angle which can actually prevent you getting going. And then you've got, I guess, part of that characteristic then is the goals that you haven't met, the things that you haven't achieved for whatever reason, whether that's procrastination or whether that's just because they're not good enough. But there's a real sense of perhaps unhappiness or maybe even feeling slightly depressed about the unmet goals and the things that you haven't achieved. So focusing on what hasn't been done and that kind of deficit rather than the possibilities and rather than what has been achieved, a focus on unmet goals, things that aren't good enough. It can feel like it sort of really can weigh you down. And low self-esteem is a characteristic that we see with
Mm.
perfectionism because constantly falling short of an ideal that I guess probably objectively can't ever be met anyway. So therefore you're
Mm.
always going to fall short. So it does feel like there are some strong links with low self-esteem. And
Yeah.
then also some characteristics that are projected outwards, like, for example, defensiveness. You can be quite sensitive to criticism, or what you perceive to be criticism may just be a neutral comment, but you can perceive it as criticism. So defensiveness. And also, I guess another side, well, is it a side effect? You're focusing very much on the result that you are seeking and the standard that you are seeking. There may be some collateral damage on the way. If you're only focused on the end result, then there can be lots of perhaps relationships neglected or social capital that is lost
Mm. Mm.
en
Mm.
route. There are costs to it.
Mm. I think what we're really talking about here is that striving for perfection is it's not a bad thing to be looking for quality work, but an excessive focus on perfection, I think, can lead to procrastination. I think it's its most kind of, its closest partner actually in some of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of blockers, because if we don't feel we can move forward with something, make something happen, take action on something until it is 100% perfect, then we are effectively showing up as procrastinating in that moment for whatever the reason is that sits behind it. And then if we just have that inability to move forward, if it's held up by this driver for perfection, it's this double-edged sword. On the one hand, you've got a really admirable quest for quality of work, which I think is a really great quest to have. But if it's dialed up so high that it stops you from getting stuff done, then it backfires, doesn't it? It becomes derailing.
Mm.
And
Mm.
and one, I suppose, because I have quite a strong action driver, that just takes me through that fear that you mentioned. It takes me through that question in my mind as to whether it is good enough, because my action driver kind of takes over. So maybe sometimes I put things out there that perhaps I should have spent a bit longer on, but generally speaking, I like to think I do tune into the quality aspect enough that it meets that good enough definition. And and then what you can do with the feedback or what you learn where it isn't perfect is is then to improve it, but you're improving it based on great input, making sure it's on the right track. You're improving it by helping yourself to just step back from it, to take that bigger picture view, not get too engrossed in the detail. We've talked before about the balcony and dance floor. The dance floor is where all the sort of stuff's happening, that's your operational place. And then the balcony is where you step up strategically to observe what's going on and you get a different perspective and it gives you a chance to think a bit more strategically about what's going on before you get back down on the dance floor again and get on with stuff.
that balcony is, yeah, as you say, is a strategic position. So if if you're wanting to support your strategic leadership style, then being able to observe where your value is coming from, where your impact is coming from. And I
Mm.
think when we get perfectionist tendencies, a lot of the value and the impact doesn't actually come from the bulk of the work. It's that 80-20 principle, which is 80% of the value probably comes from 20% of the work, which does
I
feel
mean,
hugely counterintuitive, but it crops up so, so often. And it's only when you get up onto that strategic balcony and look down and observe what's going on and where the impact is that you can see that. And I guess so. I mean, that takes me to kind of that perspective. The question that you'd ask yourself if you do manage to get yourself up onto that balcony is,
mm,
this idea that surely we all want our work to be perfect. We want to be perceived as perfect. We want everything about us to be top quality. But what's the cost? There is always going to be a cost of any position, and it's important to examine that cost to make sure that the exchange is worthwhile. So,
mm,
a great question to bring in here is well, what is the cost of these perfectionist behaviors? And also another great question is, by saying yes to these behaviors and habits and tendencies, what are you actually saying no to? What
mm.
what does that make impossible?
Well, an immediate one that comes to my mind is starting something new, thinking about where the thinking space that I was in before we started this podcast. I'd never done a podcast before. It was brand new. So the idea that it needed to be 100% perfect before even the first episode would go out, didn't find myself too wrapped up in, is it perfect? I found myself more wrapped up in, is it good quality?
So there's a great Stephen Bartlett quote, isn't there, around starting new things. Do you know the one I mean,
Well,
Jem?
is that tweet where everything you do first will be bad? Is it that one?
Yes, that's the one. Yes.
Yeah, so your first workout will be bad, your first podcast will be bad, your first speech will be bad, your first video will be bad, your first anything will be bad, but you can't make your hundredth without making your first.
It's great, isn't it?
Mm.
I mean, we're not quite at our 100th, are we? And
No,
I don't think our first podcast was truly bad.
no.
We're definitely getting better. But it's really important, isn't it, to remember that it's okay to be new at something. I can't possibly be perfect at this stage. It's just a physical impossibility. So kind of
And
embracing the beginner mindset.
taking that idea, if perfectionism is something that you identify as being a bit of a personal struggle at times, it could be that doing something completely unrelated, taking up a very new hobby, or doing something that puts you into that discomfort may help to normalize the feeling of not doing everything perfectly the first time. And that, there's a very legitimate therapeutic method of, immersion and trying things new to get yourself used to this feeling of doing something imperfectly that could be something to try if you then want to translate sitting with that discomfort of something not being 100% perfect in the workplace, start getting used to doing something that you're not 100% comfortable with, that is not to do with the workplace, that is completely low risk from a work perspective, but still nonetheless that you feel a bit out of your depth in some other capacity.
That's so powerful because I mean I definitely know this from experience, but whenever it comes up with coachees, it's always really powerful, which is I mean, I know when started kind of putting content out on LinkedIn, and I don't do it with any degree of formality or regularity, but I definitely remember thinking, oh, you know, I'm new at this, I suck at this, it's no good, I'm not going to do it. And then somebody pointed out to me, well, you've done a ton of new things in the last, I don't know, 5-10 years. And all of those things I was rubbish at the beginning. I learnt taekwondo, I was absolutely rubbish at that, and I ended up being a black belt. I learned to play the drums, I was rubbish at that, and now I'm in a band. There's a whole bunch of things I was totally rubbish at. But somehow or other, those things didn't bother me. Like you say, outside of the work sphere, it was kind of play. It didn't
Mm.
matter that I was rubbish. I felt the critical thing was just being committed and enjoying
mm,
it. And maybe those are the characteristics that actually get you better. And so applying that perspective of kind of commitment and enjoyment, which
mhm,
I had out of work, into a kind of work related thing, which was posting content,
mm,
was like, oh, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And mostly when you challenge coaches, there will always be some area where they are much more kind of chilled about
mm,
the final result and the quality of the output. And so
mm,
where can you find those areas in your life where actually you're quite happy? It might be cooking, you're quite happy to serve up something that's a bit shonky, but actually tastes great. Or, it doesn't taste great, but it's used up all the leftovers in the fridge. Whatever. There'll be some shortfall, and actually that's perfectly okay.
mm,
So
mm.
that idea of looking through different lenses is a really good one when you're exploring the cost or what you might be saying no to. I mean, not getting
Yeah.
things done we've talked about. So, I mean, that idea of not getting as much done as you could be getting done because you're trying to do them to too high a standard and therefore they're just simply taking too long. And I guess the other thing that's a cost of perfectionist is that I think it's very tempting to kind of get your head down and just work on something and work and work and work and therefore not include others because you don't want to
Mm,
share it until it's good enough. And I know this from managing a team. I had a guy in my team who was brilliant, but he went into so much detail so early. And I had to really watch it because we'd talk about a piece of work that needed to be done. And we'd say, okay, well, we've got, I don't know, 3 days to get this piece of work done or whatever it might have been. And he would squirrel away for the 3 days and then present a finished piece at the end, which
mm,
occasionally would be fine. But generally in the workplace, you have to kind of involve other people. You have to get other people's input. You have to manage your stakeholders. You have to
mm,
check that the direction of travel is the same as what someone else is thinking. And so often I would be assuming that the next stage would be like 2 hours later, he'd come back with like a one pager or some bullet points to say, right, I think this is the direction I'm going to go in. What do you think? And get a high level buy-in. Then maybe after a day, you might have a skeleton plan of what you're going to do. And you might take that to a few other stakeholders and run it by the client to say, this is going to be our approach. And they'll buy into that. And then you'll go away and start putting the detail around it. But I guess if you just head down and saying, oh, I have to get this perfect before I share it with anybody, then you're missing out on good ideas that may come from other people. You're
mm,
missing out on stakeholder engagement.
mhm,
You are increasing the likelihood that your expectations and those of your manager or your client or whoever might be expecting this work might be misaligned. So you may not deliver them what they actually want. And it's really inefficient. And then it gets to the point where you do want all the detail. You do want everything to be really perfect, which might be your final draft of whatever it is. It might be a presentation that's going to the client. It might be the coding that's about to go live. It could be absolutely anything. But there is a point at which it does need to be perfect. But it kind of only needs to be perfect at the end. You're missing out on taking people on that journey with you. It'll be your piece of
mhm.
work, our piece of work. And you might actually end up letting people down because actually what I wanted was a one-page bullet point list of suggestions of how we could tackle this.
For me, this really shines a light on the difference between critiquing piece of work, the output, and critiquing the process to achieve that piece of work. And if you present a finished article 3 days later, feeling very proud of it, having sweated blood and tears over it, and it is then critiqued, that feels really challenging. And it's also very tempting as the manager to be critiquing the output when really I think it's a stronger value to encourage that person to operate in the way that you've described. Give me a one pager, give me some headlines, let's involve some people. What's the direction of travel? Who do we need to make sure we've got the right input from? And actually helping them with the process of pulling this together then enables the end result to not necessarily be the thing that is critiqued, because that then can lead to us thinking, well, I'm no good at this because look, it's all been pulled apart. Whereas if it had been done in a slightly different way, there may be a different outcome.
That's a really good point, isn't it? It's almost cyclical, this kind of, you know,
Mm,
highly critical and maybe taking criticism or critique evaluation really
mm,
personally. It just perpetuates the myth that you're not good enough. when actually that kind of striving for perfection in the first place is what made it not good enough.
I have no idea how schooling works now, but it does make me think about my own schooling a few years ago, where where it was very much about the essay that then was that's the that end article, isn't it? That's the piece that is critiqued rather
Yeah.
than the process to achieve that essay. So I think we are schooled from a very early age that the end article is the thing that needs to be perfect.
Mhm.
And we take that into the workplace. And I think that what we need in the workplace is the right process. And then the output becomes much stronger. And we need to get used to that. Now, if we are perfectionist in tendency, if we have a really strong perfection driver, we have to really hold ourselves firm to the idea that we don't yet know. We don't yet have that perfect output, but we're going to get there through a process of steps. And this is how we're going to approach it. And I'm going to worry less about how perfect the output is. And instead, I'm going to focus on the incremental points to get to that output.
And I think you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of strategic leadership, which after all is what this podcast is all about, which is we're often dealing with things that we don't know the precise answer to. A lot of this
Mm.
stuff hasn't been done before. A lot of this stuff we don't know exactly how it's going to pan out. And so following a robust process rather than trying to control the outcome does feel like a more
Mm.
strategic approach and one that will be recognized and valued within the organization. So I guess
Yeah.
as we wrap up, it's that idea that it comes back to the idea of getting back on the balcony, zooming out for a big picture, avoiding that temptation to zoom right in and micromanage the detail and get it perfect. But the big picture is we are making progress. It's moving in the right direction. I think you had a great expression, which is that progress is a better P word to aim for than perfection. Perfec
Yes, but I've built on that since we were talking about this before. So it wasn't the perfect quote because I feel like I've got something a little bit better now,
Oh, go.
which is picture, process, and progress. They're the P's
Ooh,
to
the
lead to
3 Ps
perfection.
of fighting perfectionism.
They are.
Say that again.
The three P's of fighting perfectionism: picture, as in the big
As
picture,
in the big picture, yeah?
process, as in
Yeah,
how we're going to get there, and
yeah,
progress. What are we doing?
yeah, and moving forward. Yeah, I like that, and look at that, a live strategic model created on the spot for you. Don't say we don't bring great value on this podcast.
Well, thanks for that, Fee. As ever, the time has flown by, but I think that we covered some really interesting ground there on perfectionism. So, if perfectionism is something that you find yourself a little bit stuck with from time to time, then hopefully some of the things that we've talked about today are things that maybe you can consider and to put into place and give it a go and see if it just helps to dial that perfectionist driver down just that little bit
Enough, that's a great word, isn't it? Enough.
enough. Thank you. Thanks, V.
Thanks, Jem. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to access more of our recordings. And if you think it'd be useful for someone else, please forward to them and leave a review. We base our content on questions we are regularly asked and what you want to know more about, so please do email us with any questions or comments to gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk. And remember, you're already being more strategic than you realise.